The only way that we can exercise true freedom is in ownership.
In a nutshell, we don't have enough of a voice in our country because we don't own enough.
Apple is announcing it is funding expanded education programs for Hispanic and Black college students.
I think that this is the time for all hustlers to unite, that we all can make whatever we want to be a part of.
This is Opportunity Miami, a show about the entrepreneurs, civic leaders, and innovators who are solving the issues that will define Miami's economic future. I'm your host, Matt Hagman. The figures are appalling and remarkably consistent. Even as funding increases, the amount of money going to Black entrepreneurs remains strikingly low. In the first half of 2021, venture funding allocated to Black startup founders quadrupled to nearly $1.8 billion, but only amounted to 1.2% of overall VC startup investment. As the U.S. becomes increasingly diverse and is in the midst of an historic demographic shift, how we build our future companies is marked by a stunning lack of diversity. However, increasing attention is being focused on solving this problem. Here in Miami, that includes organizations like the Center for Black Innovation, investment groups such as Black Angels Miami, entrepreneurship collective Black Men Talk Tech, and even bi-coastal events like Culture Shifting Weekend. But where do things stand? And what do we need to be doing to build an ecosystem that is truly equitable? We'll explore. Powered by the Beacon Council, this is Opportunity Miami. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, companies such as Apple, PayPal, and Google pledged millions to help Black founders. But at the lead of the pack, SoftBank. In response to the inequities of Black and brown founders, SoftBank launched the Opportunity Fund, a $100 million fund to help close the gap. We spoke with Shu Nyatta, managing partner, SoftBank Group International, and part of the Opportunity Fund's leadership, about building a truly diverse innovation ecosystem. Shu Nyatta, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's go back to May of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered. That, of course, was this great awakening. And at SoftBank, this was a moment where, within about 8 days of George Floyd's murder, you had made a decision. And you made a decision to launch the Opportunity Fund, a $100 million fund focused specifically on Black founders. Latinx and Indigenous as well. But George Floyd's murder was the impetus. Talk to us about why you did it and what you hope to achieve with the Opportunity Fund.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the representation of racially underrepresented professionals at SoftBank is just like anywhere else in the investment business, meaning there aren't that many. But we're lucky that we have a couple. And Marcelo Claure, who's my boss and partner, is one of the most senior people at SoftBank. He's Bolivian, Latino gentleman, entrepreneur. And I'm Black, I'm from Africa. I migrated to the US when I was college years. So we care deeply about these issues. They affect us differently because we are from these populations. We've dealt with racism in the US. We understand the vibe a little more personally. And so when the George Floyd event happened, it was a precipitating event for thinking about what we should be doing as an investment firm around this topic of race. And the natural thing would be to put out a press release and say we stand in support and all of that kind of stuff, which every other organization was doing. But Marcelo's challenge to me was we need to do something more. We need to do what we do as a company, which is invest. And we need to get a fund up and running. That's just the most straightforward thing we can do that speaks much louder than a press release. So we got on a call, and we got on a call 7 days after George Floyd. And
wow.
the eighth day we had launched the fund. So it was really driven by the fact that it was urgent and real and personal, is how I would put it.
Extraordinary. Talk to us about what has happened since, the sort of companies you've invested in, how many How much of the $100 million that you've deployed to date?
About 60 companies, more than 60 in fact, and about 3/4 of the capital. So $75 million, roughly speaking, rough numbers, $75 million in 60 companies. And that's over, in some cases, multiple rounds in the same company, because some of the early stage companies we invested in now are raising subsequent capital. But the wonderful thing about the portfolio, if you look at the logos and what the companies are doing and what they're raising and from whom and all of that, none of it reads like a minority portfolio. There's nothing about it that screams underrepresented founder. These are just companies addressing problems. And some of the problems are in underrepresented communities and some are not. So the very important point we've made from the beginning of this fund is the point is profit.
Yeah.
We're not trading off excellence for impact. And in fact, that's a service to the founder, because a lot of these founders want to be treated just like any other founder. They don't want a lower bar for what they're doing. They want to stand out for the quality of the company and the quality of the solutions that they're building to big problems. So it's been refreshing how broad and deep these founders are going in building really interesting companies.
Yeah, in so many ways, I mean, obviously there is a social good from this work, but it's really not driven by trying to find a social good. It's really driven by a business opportunity, is it not? That is that focusing on entrepreneurs who really have been overlooked.
It is, and social good and business opportunity are starting to be understood correctly now as non-opposites.
Yeah.
We call it ESG, that's the hot term of the day. But really what it means is profit and social impact are not these dichotomous things. They're often very related, and seeing them together can be more powerful than seeing them apart. So these founders are overlooked for the wrong reason. They're false negatives. That makes them very attractive investment opportunities. There's a concept of alpha in the public market, which is where are there opportunities that are not over-capitalized? And these founders of color represent just that. So they're building high-quality businesses, they have less capital. And that means you can get a bigger ownership stake for a certain amount of money. You can be a true partner to them as they build meaningful businesses. So it truly is all about profit. But the other thing that funding these founders does is it creates really powerful examples. People talk about the capital gap to founders of color. There's another gap. It's the permission gap. And this is a softer gap. It's hard to describe and understand. Founders don't feel they have the right to start a company. They don't feel they can take the social risk to start a company. They don't have the friends and family that'll just write them a check to start a company. And when you create examples of other founders who look like them, that sense of permission increases. The sense that they're being imposters decreases, and you get more founders. So there is that really direct impact on future founders that you get from elevating current founders. We think that's very powerful.
Let's zoom out on that. Now that you've been deep in this work since June of 2020, I mean, the numbers are both appalling and consistent. You go back to 2016, 0.8% of venture funding went to Black founders. Last year, it was 0.6, actually down. First half of this year, it was 1.25% of Black founders. What do you see as we zoom out and look at this really acute and alarming problem? If this is going to be the way we're going to build companies going forward, we have a real problem. What are those things that we need to solve for? What are those barriers that we need to remove?
There's a wonderful thing in venture called a friends and family round.
Yeah.
Often this is how companies get started. Mark Zuckerberg, all these other famous founders that we celebrate who dropped out of school or had initial capital raised from their circle, their immediate community, have wealth in their community that has appetite for taking that sort of risk that they're doing. The friends and family round is a huge source of bias in the system. If you go talk to 10 Black founders and 10 Latino founders and ask them how much capital they could raise from quote unquote friends and family, it is starkly different from upper middle class Mark Zuckerberg raising from his friends and family. And so part of the issue is right at the top of the funnel, where the initial company formation, where someone's taking that financial risk to drop out of Stanford or to drop out of Harvard or to leave their job at Google or to leave their job at JP Morgan in order to do a startup. That's a very risky decision. And so really at the beginning of the company foundation process is where you need the most support to help people take that leap. Now we at the Opportunity Fund don't fund pre-launch, pre-seed companies, But you have vehicles like Y Combinator and others that do a really good job of creating those founders right at the top of the funnel. That's where the most work is needed, frankly. And then once they graduate from that initial company formation phase, they go into building a product and building a company, and that's where we step in. And we can help them scale up. We can give them access to the ecosystem at SoftBank. We can give them access to all the knowledge that's embedded within SoftBank to help them scale the companies up.
So as we think about whether it's friends and family round and how we see that tilt so dramatically towards the privileged or the risks you were talking about of being willing to leave a post at Google or Facebook to go launch a business, what are the things that we should be leaning into as we think about this, as we zoom out and think about from a macro level, how to begin tackling this problem?
The most important thing to realize, I think, is this is not a 1-week affair. Yeah. It's not a 1-year affair. Maybe it's not even a 10-year affair. The most important thing is consistent effort over time, because what you want to create is this self-reinforcing flywheel of founders who do not any longer feel underrepresented. And the way you get that is you have the initial crop of those founders successfully go public, successfully generate wealth, plow it back into the system. That takes years. So the first thing you need is patience. And the difficult thing about that is in corporate environments, often you need to show results very quickly. And so when people are allocating capital to ESG or to emerging managers or to Black founders, they often want to say in a year or 2 years, here are our results. It's been so great for us. That is not the game. The game is a multi-year patient game, and it's a very different one. So that's the first thing, patience. The second thing that's very important in this market is validity. So the advantage of being at a place like SoftBank is it's a recognized brand. Now, we're not alone. There are many other powerful brands, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Apple, you name it. The reason that matters is when people take this risk, when they're crossing this permission gap that I described earlier, one of the most important things for them is to be able to tell the story of what they're doing to their communities. It sounds like a small thing. It's a big thing. And to be able to tell that story effectively to their communities, to people they want to recruit to join the company, to customers they want to sell their products to, it is very powerful to be able to say, I have an investment from SoftBank, or I have an investment from Apple, or I have an investment from JP Morgan. That confers a level of validation that is very, very powerful. So it's not just about capital. This isn't about pooling a bunch of capital from family offices and providing it to founders of color. You need these branded platforms to confer a level of validation that is also missing for many of these founders and helps them build the rest of their business. What we've learned is it's not that difficult if you have the brand to do this work. You just have to be a little patient and commit to building a team. It doesn't have to be a big one, to actually being in the market and doing the work. So what we've done is replicable by every major company that you can think of. Truly, I believe that. And the value that they bring on top of the capital is something that cannot be replicated. So the challenge I would give is this is about large, powerful corporate brands, especially financial services brands, lending that brand with some capital to validate an entire community of founders and doing it patiently over time in order to create examples that then start to self-generate the whole ecosystem again.
So in so many ways, I mean, what you're saying is that those who have some level of standing, a well-known brand, some position of respect in their respective community around the world, that they really have an obligation, that if they care about this issue, that they have the ability more than really any others to lean in and make a real difference here.
Absolutely. And that is free in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
All that equity that they've built over many decades of doing business the right way with their customers and with their constituents is just as powerful as the capital they can bring.
Now, as we think about the efforts here in Miami, are there models elsewhere, models around the world that we should look to and think of that have worked particularly well as we think about how just in our, of course, we across the country and around the world, want to be making a difference. But here in Miami, what are some models that we could look to as we think about propelling Black founders and removing barriers?
The most successful incubator in the world is called Y Combinator. Y Combinator itself has become its own brand. And it's become a brand that is then relied on by other very powerful brands, branded capital in Silicon Valley, Sequoia, Benchmark, Andreessen Horowitz, all these names that you've heard of and know. They rely on Y Combinator to provide this top of the funnel of companies that they will then subsequently invest in. That incubator model is a very, very powerful one. Others have tried to copy it, but haven't done it anywhere near the success level that Y Combinator has. So if I could snap my fingers, I would replicate Y Combinator everywhere. Now, the problem with that is it's all about selectivity. And so when you get selective, you exclude by definition. But Y Combinator has done a great job of being more inclusive. A lot of companies we've invested in from the Opportunity Fund came out of Y Combinator. Wow. They're doing a really great job under Michael Siebel's leadership, and he's Black, of finding founders from the non-traditional places. That is the work that's needed, is right at the beginning of the process of founding a company. So if I were Miami, I'd partner with very credible, I'd convince Mike Siebel at Y Combinator to launch Miami Y Combinator. He's unlikely to do it because there's no reason to be located in a particular place, but that would be the holy grail. And if not that, then I'd launch an incubator similar to what Station F have done in France that is truly, truly world-class, and that creates these founders at a certain level of quality because it's teachable. It's a science, the science of startups. It's not just an art. It is also an art, but it is a science. And you can make better companies if you teach these founders the right way to do it, and you attract them to a place like Miami, which everybody wants to come to.
You know, we had Michael here a couple years ago. He came here and spoke at Black Tech Week. So you never know. Maybe we can.
You and I will work on it. We'll work on it.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Now, have there been any ripple effects since you took this, this really extraordinary step in a week's time of launching the Opportunity Fund and doing it differently? That is, actually staffing up, building a team, and taking a long-term approach rather than, as we saw with many corporates and big tech firms, writing a check. Certainly that makes a difference. But your approach is different. Have you seen a ripple effect, others adopting the same approach that you have?
Not yet. So a lot of firms have come out and they've made statements about doing things, and they've actually deployed capital. But for some reason, people are afraid of making direct investments. And it's frankly not clear to me why. So my encouragement would be, we have established a model that is very replicable by big firms. And we'd love it if people copied it and rolled it out. We don't need to get credit for any of this. I think it's the better way to do the work for all the reasons I mentioned before. It's not just about capital, it's also about permission. And these big branded firms can play such a big role there. So I'm not sure why the ripple effect hasn't been more direct investing teams inside of these big firms. I think that would be the wonderful outcome. And hopefully there's still time for that to happen.
Now, for the business leader, someone who may not be, who is running a financial firm or a VC firm that could immediately move into this, but someone who just cares about the issue, what would you say to that person about what they should think about and what they might be able to do?
This is hard work. And if you care, the best way to do it is to do the hard work. So empty rhetoric, I think, has had its time for quite a while. The difficult thing now is to actually put stuff into practice. Now, an alternative solution, which is something we think about a lot as we think about the evolution of the Opportunity Fund. By the way, we deliberately called it the Opportunity Fund. It's not called SoftBank Opportunity Fund because we want this neutral vehicle that stands on its own. It would be wonderful if that became a coalition of a certain number of firms who all pool their capital and their resources in one place. Now, that's an idea that potentially has legs. And we're open to having those kinds of discussions with some of our large peer firms in the financial services business. But you can't you can't just talk anymore. Unfortunately, that's just not enough. So caring is manifested in doing. And even internally at SoftBank, the difficulty with a firm as large as ours is getting the airtime for a smaller venture effort that is before the Vision Fund, which is our big fund. And that does not naturally lead into the Vision Fund because you still need a couple more rounds between the Opportunity Fund and the Vision Fund. So it's internal work too, but you need people who want to put in the energy to do that.
What would you say if, for the government official, who wants to lean in on this, the elected leader, if they want to help, what are ways that they can help in trying to drive change?
They got to talk to their constituent firms. Again, I will hammer the point.
I love it.
Validation matters. And so you got to go knock on the doors of the firms who have validity in your community and tell them they have to step up.
I love it. I love it. Shu, as you think about 5 years, 10 years from now, what do you hope that the Opportunity Fund will have achieved?
I hope it doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. We hope we write ourselves out of existence completely. And people don't think of going to funds that have a specific mandate around founders of color, that they just go to all the funds and the funds fund whatever the good business idea is, and they're a bunch of diverse founders creating companies.
Well, Shu, I can't help but ask as we close, it's been 3 months since you moved to Miami. How's it going?
I'm lucky in the sense that I've moved around a lot. I'm unlucky in the sense that I don't feel I have a particular home. But Miami has captured me immediately. So I'm here with my family, and maybe that's part of the difference. It's the first time I've made a big move with a whole family. And we've found it to be extraordinarily welcoming. That's the word I'd use, is people want to create a delightful experience for you here. Everything from the housing experience to the schools experience has been people saying, welcome, how can I help? Which is just a wonderful feeling to have. So we're delighted to be here. We're gonna be here for a while. We're gonna be part of the community. That's the goal of being here, is trying to actually invest in the place where we are, not just be tourists in the place where we live, which is a little bit what it felt like in San Francisco for the past decade, is people don't really care. And so we're here to care, and we're excited to be here.
Well, we're thrilled you're here. Shu Nyatta, thank you very much. So appreciate
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. From the earliest efforts building Miami's tech ecosystem, a belief has been that Miami can be a uniquely diverse center of entrepreneurship. Furthermore, that Miami can bring to life the idea that innovation is built on a diversity of people and ideas. But as Miami has experienced a tech wave over the past few years, the reality is that this remains very much a work in progress. A recent study by Air Ventures found an investment shortfall for women and Black entrepreneurs in Miami. However, the work continues. And we are joined by 3 remarkable leaders. Felecia Hatcher, CEO of Black Ambition, a prize competition to propel Black and Latinx entrepreneurs. Felecia previously co-founded the Center for Black Innovation. Brian Brackeen, who founded Lightship Capital, a venture fund focused on underrepresented founders. And Sherrell Dorsey, the founder and CEO of The Plug, a digital news and insights platform covering the Black innovation economy. Sherrell Dorsey, Felecia Hatcher, Brian Brackeen, welcome. So, really want to focus our conversation on Miami. But before we do that, wanted to go broad a little bit and really focus on defining, how should we be thinking about the problem that we're trying to solve here? And Sherrell, I want to start with you. It was back in 2016 when you launched The Plug. As we looked at VC funding for Black founders, it was 0.08% of overall VC funding. Last year, 0.06. This year, we're up to, the last I saw, we're up a little over 1%, 1.2. Appalling and consistent. But I guess my question I want to start off with, is that how we should be thinking of the problem that we need to be solving? Or is it much broader and deeper than that?
Matt, it is such a great question. And thank you for having me to have a conversation about this challenge. Consistently, funding for Black and brown entrepreneurs has been low. We've known this over the last decade. The movement has been incremental. very incremental. And when we start to parse that down into even just what Black women get funded, it is still even less than 1%. It's even less than 0.5%. In fact, it is even less than 0.02%. And again, we understand what the data has been telling us, but I would argue that we are also hyper-focused on part of the most insignificant components of this. We've been asking the industry to take notice and to make a change versus creating and providing new opportunities, channels, and subsets of work that can really help to propel entrepreneurs of color and those that are looking to build companies that are actually investable along the spectrum. And so I think that there are some important firms that are starting to kind of see that opportunity with better connecting with entrepreneurs and communities of color who are looking at and helping to move companies along the continuum to help them become the kind of companies that venture capital is looking to fund. We're still very nascent in our questioning about how to do that effectively. And I think that Miami and kind of the uniqueness of its ecosystem and the growth of its ecosystem has a unique opportunity to really think about how do we set up founders for success, particularly those that have historically been underrepresented and excluded from this conversation.
I want to follow up on that, but Felecia, I want to turn to you. We've talked about this before, about focusing, using the metrics around VC funding as one of the illustrations of the great disparity we see, but it goes beyond that. Talk about that.
Yeah, I always push back that like we can't only measure startups or businesses only on the amount of money that they can raise, right? Like that's one, and it's an important factor, but you know, if we can build companies that have strong revenue, like at the end of the day, I'm personally more impressed by that, right? That they can become employers, that they have longer, more sustainable companies over time. Maybe the growth is slower, but so what, right? Like we're always going to need that. And I think when we play on our strengths here in Miami, we can't ever lose sight at that for the sake of building a tech and startup ecosystem. Like both of those can raise at the same time, and both of them are equally important. You know, honestly, like even when I took on the role with Black Ambition, that's something that I had to course correct in the organization because we were only looking at, are these companies venture backable? But we were missing companies that had significant revenue. You're talking about $400,000 or $500,000 in revenue. Like, why aren't we looking at those companies? Why can't we align the same resources that we are offering the venture backable companies with companies that have really strong revenue? And so we do have to look at all of that. And then we also have to look at companies that are just traditional small businesses that happen to play really well in the startup space, given the resources that are available there. So you're thinking more tech-enabled companies that are also strengths that we can lean on when we are matching that with the culture and culture being an asset in Black and brown communities, especially here in Miami.
Now, Brian, you are a VC now, an entrepreneur before. Now you're investing in entrepreneurs. But as we think about whether it's venture-backed companies, whether it's small businesses that potentially could scale someday, but that's not part of the plan at the outset. How do you define the problem that we need to solve as we sit here right now?
I agree with both these guys. We see women, particularly Black women-led companies, absolutely struggling to raise capital, independent of how much money they've actually earned, right?
Yeah.
Our last few investments have been in Black women-led companies. They were doing millions and millions of dollars revenue, but couldn't find anyone to lead their round. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, people are selling cat images, right, for tens of millions of dollars, right, to investors. And so that just tells you that there's a problem in the market, right? And so we need to solve that both on the VC side, but also in the traditional business side.
But let me follow up on that. What is that problem? Is it just out-and-out bias?
Mixture of many things.
Yeah.
I think that people are uncomfortable with the fact that some percentage of decision makers in the world are racist. Right. And that's hard for people to just, you don't want to believe that Bob on the other side, you know, you've been to a concert with him, it seems like a nice guy, but Bob may have a bias. And even bias is a kind of too nice a word for some of these.
Right,
some people,
right. That's being kind.
Yeah.
Right?
Some percentage of Americans are racist. And so in a world where we need unanimous votes to invest in these companies, that person is never going to invest in the woman or the minority-led company. A misogynist is going to ask her about having a kid, or how focused are you, or what's your husband think about this, right? You're never going to get to the real business because you're asking her the wrong questions. So we've got to really eliminate these folks from the decision-making process.
So now, of course, with George Floyd's murder, that was a moment when this issue, right, support of Black founders, supporting Black entrepreneurs generally, was something that was highlighted. And we saw lots of corporates, we saw big tech announcing these commitments of dollars that they were pledging to support Black entrepreneurs and to support economic growth among, within the Black community. What's changed? And has anything changed? And Sherrell, I want to start with you. Has anything changed?
Yes and no. Our team was actually one of the first to start looking at how big tech companies were making these pledges, really analyzing that against the actual diversity data within their own companies, and start to track and understand how these pledges were making changes either on a monetary basis or within internal company culture, things like hiring or adding more Black and brown people to their boards. And we did an evaluation this summer in partnership with Fast Company to go back and understand, out of the over $3 billion that had been committed, what had already been deployed. And then also, were there some longstanding issues and challenges that have been raised within some of these companies, and to see if those things changed. And honestly, the results were mixed. And I think that I speak for many of us who understood that this sort of environment, in this uprising, helped to elicit a change for kind of a temporary moment of time where the dollar started to flood in. We saw organizations get greater access to capital. We saw the largest number of Black VC firms get incredible opportunities to have investments, whereas a lot of times it took them 4 or 5 years just to raise a micro fund. But in terms of the changes, there's definitely much more attention. However, is it widespread? Is it permanent? Does it signify a sense of growth? That's not what we're necessarily seeing in the data, but there are glimmers of hope along the way.
Brian, what are you seeing?
We have a demography problem and a geography problem as well. If you think back historically to where, let's say, African Americans lived and were enslaved, mostly the South, right? And then escaped up the East Coast into your Philadelphia, your New York, your Boston, and then up the Mississippi River, right, and up and ultimately to Chicago. So this is where these populations historically lived. And so if we're going to do work, we have to be doing work in the Midwest and the South, or else we're not going to hit the populations that were most effective. What we see with these pledges is West Coast companies have very little interest in investing in founders in these geographies, even when they're focused on Black founders, right? And so we've actually decided as a fund to stop pitching West Coast firms because they just refuse to invest in the Midwest and the South.
Felecia, have you seen a change?
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, and I want to just give some, preface it with, you were way ahead of the game. I mean, you launched Black Tech Week in 2014.
Yeah.
Right? So, and of course, Code Fever before that. And now, of course, the Center for Black Innovation and Black Ambition. But as we go back to this moment in time when that shook us all with George Floyd's murder, what's changed?
Black squares on Instagram is what changed, right? And they've changed back to whatever.
Right.
That was the immediate thing that we saw. There were a lot of commitments, just like Sherrell said, with the data that they had about what $66 billion had been promised, and I think less than $4 billion has been allocated. And that was not just entrepreneurship, right? That was supposed to be community infrastructure, housing, healthcare, childcare. Like, it was supposed to be across the board. We got calls from corporations that were like, well, we don't actually know what to do. Don't tell anybody, but what can we do? And what can we do by next Friday? I'm like, nothing, right? And so if this has to be not just a moment, it has to be a movement. And it has to be baked into the KPIs of your organization. And it has to be baked into the ethos of what you plan to do over the next 100 years, because we have a lot of companies that are planning not just for next year, they're planning the next 50 to 100 years. And so tell us what that looks like in the next 100 years. And tell us what that looks like in your community and your businesses and the vendors that you use over the next 10, 20, 30 to 40 years, because that's what we're looking to see. It's been a year, right? We're going into year 2. And so tell us what the problem is as to why you felt so comfortable to make that commitment as publicly as you did, but you have, for whatever reasons, you cannot allocate that capital into the areas in which it's going to start having some very systemic changes in the communities that you said that you cared about. And that's the problem, right? And I think that was nationally. And then when you talk about Miami, we were talking about that. Like, I saw very, very few Miami companies. And we have, over 1,200 multinational corporations in South Florida that actually made a commitment and then actually deployed that capital. And that's also a problem here, right? And then the patience of, like, once you deploy it, then, like, it's going to take time in order to actually start seeing the impact and returns. But you cannot fix a problem that is a multi-generational problem with a hashtag, with a black square, and within 2 weeks. It doesn't work like that.
Right. If I could piggyback
Please,
on that.
please.
I think that we talk about COVID fatigue, right? And how there's also George Floyd fatigue with corporations, right? Where they did their thing and that was it, and they took a step back. It's important that the black employees at these organizations push them to continue to do work.
You know, the work that Sherrell did and the plug did was so important because it was actually tracking that, right? No one was taking the time to track that. They were only celebrating that this is the announcement that was made. But it's like, you know, a year later, months later, a year later, well, where has the capital actually gone so that we can hold you accountable, right? And then everyone has the tools to be able to say, like, this is not okay, because it's not.
Right.
You know, but I think as things start to die down, people lose sight of those commitments. And then what happens is, well, we tried.
Right.
And no one applied, right? Which are conversations I'm having now. So we're going to silently reallocate that funding, which is also something that we're starting to see right now, too.
I think what has changed, Matt, is that we are asking for greater accountability and transparency, especially from companies who are able to sort of hide behind being private and not having to share externally what does diversity, culture, policies actually look like at their companies. And there's such a greater demand. When we started to see employees using our database of these tech statements in work to build use cases for changing the way in which recruiting practices were taking place, or at least creating more conversation at work about the lack of diversity, that was a tool that they were able to leverage the data to show in one sort of singular platform that we've got to change. We've got to change. Look at what our counterparts are doing, what our peers and our competitors. And so I think that this demand for transparency is ongoing. And I know that there are a lot of organizations that are also asking for these companies to update regularly. It's not enough to just have this kind of hidden diversity, equity, inclusion report, but there is now more demand for, listen, tech, you're talking about big data being the new oil. Well, we want to see your data as well. So I think accountability and that transparency movement is something that's here to stay.
So, you know, each of you brings different perspectives: the VC, the ecosystem builder, the entrepreneur, Sherrell, the journalist. Let's talk about what's working from each of your perspectives. What are those things that we can point to as bright spots to build on? Brian, we'll start with you.
Acknowledgement of the problem is actually really, really important. Yeah. There was a period 5-6 years ago when it was kind of accepted that there was a pipeline problem, right? To your point about no one's applying, right? That we had to fight that fight for some time. I think now people know the 0.8% numbers and the 1.2% number. I think people know that. That's huge. There are certain cities that are doing better jobs than others. And we do a lot of work in Cincinnati. The state recently made a $12 million grant for us to build something similar to the Center for Black Innovation there, right?
And so talk about what you're going to do there.
Beautiful 3-story old church, converting it to a space where women and minority founders can go with free co-working on one floor, venture capital on the next, and a full studio to help them build their dreams on the third, right? It's going to be an amazing spot. And these things aren't free, right? They need to be supported. And the state of Ohio, the University of Cincinnati, the city, others have all put in to make the space a reality. As
you look across the landscape right now, what are those things that are working and that we should double down on?
Yeah, you know, I think I'll start with the Black ambition side first. It's more people that have power and wealth that are not necessarily corporations that are getting into the conversations and contributing. They're contributing the platform that they have, and they're also contributing dollars, right? Which is really what Black Ambition is. And so having more people that have that level of influence, have the ear of people that may not understand, but they understand that relationship. And as a result of that, they're doing some investment. I can accept that, and I can roll with that, right? And so we're starting to see more of that. You're starting to see more celebrities in the space as well, right? Which is good and bad, but there's a lot of good that's a part of that, meaning that, again, like I said, that they have a platform, they have a following, and they have ears that have dollars. And so that part on the Black Ambition side, we funded 34 companies this year. We supported about 300 companies this year. A lot of those companies were overlooked prior to applying for the prize, which at the end of the day, like, it breaks my heart, because it's just like, but this is a phenomenal company that you did not pay attention to until they won the prize. So on one end, it solidifies why the prize is important, but on the other end, it's just like, what else do you have to do?
Right.
How much do you have to work? How many pitch competitions do you have to apply? How many meetings, how many phone calls, how many pitches do you have to do for you to understand the business opportunity that you are missing out on because you're overlooking these companies because they don't match a certain profile of what you're used to? Like, we're at this point where that is beyond unacceptable. Like, it just is, right? And then, with Center for Black Innovation, it's really about space. That space was the first co-working space in a Black neighborhood to exist at the time that we built it 5 years ago. Wow. And people would clap, but I'm like, that's not okay. Like, right. Not okay at all, and we need to replicate those type of spaces or convenings that bring innovation and entrepreneurship and people and dollars into every single community within the county, especially, but throughout the state of Florida. Like, that is the opportunity. All of those pieces have to happen at the same time. So I think when we talk about, well, what is the problem? There are multiple problems.
Right.
And when we talk about what is the solution, there have to be multiple solutions and multiple people all coming at the problems at all different types of areas and different perspectives and solutions to what we're trying to solve. Like, that's the only way that this is going to move forward.
Sherrell, you bring a really interesting perspective. As we mentioned earlier, originally from Seattle, you lived all over the world. And of course, we're all grateful that more recently you've been living in Miami. But as you look at Miami, what do you think are the things that we need to be focusing on here, specifically in Miami, to begin to make a dent on this huge, huge problem?
As a journalist, narrative always matters. I think that the last few years, when we've talked about the coverage of Black founders, particularly within business and tech, and sort of being able to predict what does the future of these areas look like across industries, the newsroom has traditionally been very intellectually lazy when it's come to asking questions of, again, those who have been underestimated, underrepresented, historically excluded from spaces. And so we went from a world of let's continue to ask Black founders, let's continue to ask female founders what it's like to be Black or female or other in these spaces. And that kind of language, again, kind of separated and created this otherness amongst the regular conversation of like white tech guys kind of ruling the world and ruling the planet. And so now that the newsroom is starting to capture a different kind of identity within Black innovation and renaming who gets to be called genius in this country, we're having a different kind of conversation in terms of what a Black or brown founder or what a Black or brown innovation community actually looks like. I'm really excited about that. I think when it comes to Miami specifically, at the top of the year of the pandemic, as we started to get the influx of the Bay Area folks, the New Yorkers coming in, the conversation was still feeling very homogenous. And there was a piece recently in the Miami Herald that was interviewing a local Black founder. It was one of the first articles that I saw that was actually asking Black founders from Miami about their experience and what they were excited about in this kind of rising ecosystem. I think that the hype of Miami can sometimes get a lot of very lost in terms of who we're trying to attract versus who's here, who's been building. Obviously, Felecia has been building out this robust ecosystem for so long. And the storylines of the people who live here, who raise their families here, who vote here, who show up to city council meetings and county government meetings and invest in this city long term, and not just because it's a temporary stay. Those are the underlying stories that still have incredible and immense value to be shared on national stages when it comes to talking about the narrative of the future of Miami's tech community. And so I think there's ample opportunity for us to really make the investments in the newsrooms and the reporters and the journalists who are helping to go and interview people in the communities that aren't getting the shine, who aren't appearing in the videos, but the people who have been here, who have been building, and who are connected to the programs and the institutions like Center for Black Innovation to continue to grow their companies, and who will be here long after everyone goes home.
As we sit here now in 2021, thinking about what's next for Miami, but in particular about building that truly diverse and inclusive ecosystem, what are those things that you think we need to be doing next?
I met my wife at a Black Tech Week event held in Overtown, right? 10 years ago, she was a fitness trainer, right? Now she runs the largest fund ever raised by a Black woman for first-time fund, right? All the talent is here in Miami already, and they're in a variety of other jobs, right? They only need exposure, access, and opportunity, hence opportunity in Miami, right? To get to the next level. They haven't seen it, right? We can show it to them if we're given an opportunity to show them. And I believe we can do it as a community.
Felecia, so we hear from elected leaders who want to help, who want to make a real difference. And we see this across South Florida. To that elected leader, if they really wanted to weigh in and to make a real difference, what would you say to that person?
Quite a few things, right? Elected leaders have convening power, and they're not using it for this conversation. And so it would be convene people, right? The right people, the people that can immediately say yes to moving something forward, and then also be able to write that check. That would be the first part, because it's just a superpower that people in politics have. The other part of it would be to care about this. And there's no other way around to say it, right? Like, this is really important. And of course, there are big, deep, systemic issues in our community that are everyday issues, but this is also a massive issue too, because that's where our jobs are going to come from, right? That's where better infrastructure can come from, just in the quickness and the swiftness of the tech and innovation space, as well as the resources and the dollars that are associated with that, right? Our schools should be doing better, like, as a result of tech here and our local politicians really caring and bringing the right people, the right conversations, and the right bills, presenting the right bills, right? And so we should not have F or D schools in Miami as a result of this tech boom. If we still have that in the next 2 to 3, I will even be generous, of 5 years, we are not doing something right. Our local elected officials aren't doing something right, right? Our housing, our transportation, these are all things that we have to fight for, because largely what's represented in that are Black people and our Black communities. And so there's a lot that our local politicians can do if they are not afraid of technology. And what oftentimes the conversation is, I'm interested, I don't understand it. Yeah, but you have a role that you can play in that, and bring the people in that do. And so that this can be move forward, and this can be transformational for your communities. But it's about wanting to change something. And it's okay to not understand it, but you have a platform in order to ask the right questions, and not let this continue to be something that's very performative. Because what happened with a lot of elected officials at the beginning of this year is they all formed these committees. And these committees looked amazing. But where are the committees now? And that's my frustration, right? Because those committees could do something if we had a plan together of, this is actually what we want tech and innovation and the startup community to do for our cities and to do for this county. And we have the right people to get it done. We have 5 commissioners, Black commissioners. We've never had that.
In the county.
We've never had that in Miami. And so there's a lot of power that is there, but we have to put that power to work.
And just to highlight what you were talking about states committing dollars, it's in Ohio where you were just granted $11 million.
$12 million for a new facility, but also the state of Ohio invested $5 million into the fund for us to invest in women and minority companies. So $17 million in total just to one organization. They did that with multiple organizations.
Wow.
They're committed to solving the problem. I just want to, again, storytell a bit here because I think it's important. This isn't just for the Black community. It's really for the entire community.
Right.
You can judge the health of a city by the health of its Black community. Yeah. Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1920, before the race massacre, was one of the wealthiest cities in North America. It was wealthier than Houston. It was well wealthier than its neighbors. After the race massacre, and every year since, the GDP has lowered, right? And all those people that have escaped to Chicago, again, to Houston has gotten much bigger because it's done a much better job with its minority community, right, than the massacre in Tulsa. And they're trying to change that now. But this is why this is so important. If we invest in our Black community here in Miami, we will all benefit.
Sherrell, I want to turn to you. Same question that I asked Felecia, but for that corporate leader, for that business leader here in Miami, who says, look, I want to help. I want my company, my employees making a dent on this. What would you say to that person?
I think, again, it's a very kind of noble gesture. And I completely agree with Felecia. One thing I would just add to what Felecia has already said is about long-term commitment. I think, we started this conversation with the sort of George Floyd, movement, particularly around companies and corporations wanting to get involved for the first time, learning about issues that have historically oppressed Black communities, Black people across spectrums, industries, states as well. And then sort of kind of fizzled out in terms of interest as they moved on sort of like to the next thing. And I think the opportunity here is to say, I'm going to stake a claim instead of just here's kind of a one-time thing. I don't want to break too much of a sweat, but how do I invest in long term? How do I ensure that I am also reaching across the ecosystem to learn as much as I can and leverage the resources that I have to create utility and opportunity for the community that I say I want to serve and be part of? And then also, how do I take a listening position to understand and not sort of just kind of go into these vanity projects where let's launch a new fund versus, well, what are those Black VC firms that we can actually make investments in?
Well, let's go around the horn just very quickly. The opportunity that's in front of us.
It's always going to be our people.
Brian.
Yeah, diversity is opportunity in Miami.
Sherrell.
We need more nuanced narratives of who defines genius.
Well, Sherrell Dorsey, Brian Brackeen, Felecia Hatcher, thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
To build a truly inclusive, diverse entrepreneurial ecosystem that creates groundbreaking companies, expands opportunity, and drives social mobility is something that's going to require organizations, investors, lawmakers, and others making it a priority over the long term. But the benefit to Miami will be enormous. As always, please share your ideas and thoughts on our digital platforms. We want to hear from you, and we'll see you next time on Opportunity Miami.